Hey, Chaver, what's happening? Everyone's really, really good, right? I know, I could tell. That's good. That's very, very good. Chaver, today we're studying Daf Chav Gimel of Masechta Ayruvin. Daf 23. Daf 23 isn't really that hard. Lots of technical kind of things, but there's like a big Mishnah on Daf Chav Gimel, Amud Aleph, so Mishnahs tend to not be too difficult. And then, whatever. So, we're going to discuss the context for Pasei bayraos, like is that just wells, is it watering holes? We've essentially seen this machlokas before. Requirements for a karpaf to be able to carry in a non-residential space. Can you carry in a non-residential space? So that's going to be some machlokas. Dimensions of a karpaf, right? Should it be square? Should it be rectangular? And then at the end we get into this machlokas, which it's conceptual, and then we're gonna have a shtickle cliffhanger until tomorrow because it wasn't really a very good place to stop. So shtickle cliffhanger, and that has to do with chutzner that you plant seeds in. Meaning you have a chutzner and it's larger than 2 beis sa'ah, which is fine because as long as it's residential, it could be larger than 2 beis sa'ah. But then you mess it up, you plant seeds there and you make it into a karpaf, and now you created a big mess. But it doesn't have to be that messy as long as you can just break it down into non-messy, neat machlokas. Okay. Chav Beis Amud Beis, 4 lines from the bottom at the Mishnah. Echad bo harabim uve'er harabim. Okay. So whether this is a watering hole that is in the public and available to the public, or whether it is a well that is available to the public. Now, if you remember, the nafkamina between a bore and a be'er is that a watering hole, a bore, the water is collected therein, and it can run out of water, whereas a be'er is natural water, and the assumption is that there's always water over there. Okay? Uve'er hayachid. And additionally, a well, which has natural water source, that belongs to an individual, osin and pasen. In all of those cases, you can create pasei bayraos around the well or the watering hole, right? So a well, whether it is public, whether it is private, pasei bayraos works. And a watering hole, if it's public, you can create pasei bayraos. However, aval levor hayachid Osin lo mechitza gavoa yutfachim de Rabbi Akiva. But if we're talking about a watering hole that's private, in that case, then you would have to put up proper 10 tefach walls around the private watering hole if you want to be able to take out water from the bore into the area around it on Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava Omer, in osin pasen ella leve'er rabim bilvad, ulishar osin chagura gavoa asar tefachim. Says Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, look, pasei bayraos only works for public wells. That's it. Not private wells, not public bores. Public wells, that is what pasei bayraos works for. Everything else, you need a 10 tefach wall. He says, chagura, which Rashi says hekif shel chavalim, surrounding of reeds. I don't think it specifically has to be reeds. I think if you make a wall, that would be just fine as well. But the important thing for Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava is that he limits it to only public wells. Weiter chevre. Zok the Gemara. Amr Rav Yosef, Amr Rav Yehuda, Amr Shmuel. Says Rav Yosef in the name of his Rebbe, Rav Yehuda, who says in the name of his Rebbe, Shmuel, that halacha is Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. That halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. That what? That pasei bayraos applies only to public wells. The Amr of Yosef, Amr of Yehuda, Amr Shmuel, lo huchu pasei bayraos el lever ma'im chaim bilvad. And says Rav Yosef in the name of Rav Yehuda, in the name of Shmuel, that pasei bayraos are an option only for a be'er ma'im chaim, for a well. And the question is, how come you need both of these statements of Rav Yosef in the name of Rav Yehuda and the name of Shmuel, right? Why does he need to tell us both that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, and that pasei bayraos only applies to wells? I mean, if the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava said pasei bayraos applies only to public wells. So those are the criteria. It must be a well and it must be public. So why do I then need to say that the halacha is that Pasei bayraos is only by wells? Obviously, the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. It's only by wells. Not only just by wells, but by public wells. So the Gemara says, Utzricha. Because if Rabbi Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel would have said just that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, well, I might think that what he really means is that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava vis-a-vis that we need this thing to be public. But as long as it's public, you can make Pasei bayraos, even if it's a bore. Right? So Avamina, I would have thought, dirabim, that the important thing is that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava vis-a-vis that this water source needs to be publicly available. They can even be gathered, they can even be a bore. Well, then how come it said Davka a well that's public? That's just to the exclusion of Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva says that you can even have a well that is private. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava is saying that no, it needs to be public, but maybe it can even be a bore. That is why Rabbi Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel then had to say that Pasei bayraos is only for wells. Don't think that it could be maybe for public bores. No way, no how. Only for wells. And if we would only know that the halacha is that Pasei bayraos is relevant for wells, well then, Hava Amina, Loshna Deram, Loshna Deyachid, I may have thought that maybe when it comes to a well, as long as it's a well, you can create Pasei bayraos, whether it's public, whether it's private. Kamash Milan, Halacha Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, which is why they also had to say that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, that wells must be public, they can't be private. So, okay, very, very nice. So the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, that Pasei bayraos are relevant for public wells, that is it. Not private wells and not public bores. Very beautiful. Says a new Mishnah, Ve'od Amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, and additionally, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava said, Hagina ve'akarpaf, a garden or a karpaf, which is a non-residential enclosed area, shehin shivim amma v'shiraim al shivim amma v'shiraim, that are 70 and 2/3 ammas by 70 and 2/3 ammas, which are just about 5,000 square amos, as we're going to see shortly, that there's a machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim about, actually 70 and 2/3 to 70 and 2/3, technically speaking, is, I believe, 4,994 amos, which is slightly less than 5,000 amos. So there's a question about that, right, those 6 amos in between, whatever it might be. But says Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava that if you have a garden, but the assumption is basically that a space that is 70 and 2/3 ammas by 70 and 2/3 ammas is, references a base sa'asayim, which is 2 sa'ah, which is essentially 5,000 amos. Fine. 5,000 square amos. Fine. So again, Ve'od Amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, says Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, Hagina ve'akarpaf, the garden, if you plant seeds in this area, ve'akarpaf, or some non-residential enclosed space, but it's not for living. Shein shivim amma v'shiraim al shivim amma v'shiraim, that there are 70 and 2/3 amas by 70 and 2/3 amas, i.e., basically a base sa'asayim. Hamukafuz gader gavoa asar, and is surrounded by a fence that is 10 tfachim tall. Asar tfachim. Metaltalin bisocha, you are permitted to carry in this area. Uvilvad, you hear this, chevra? Sheyeba shomera o bezdira o shtei smucha la'ir. However, says Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, a crucial requirement is that there has to be some kind of guard's hut in there, some kind of a hut in this enclosed area, or a house, or that it's close to a city. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava is saying that an enclosed area that is a maximum size of a beis sa'asayim, you can carry in there if it's for living in it. I.e., these karpafs that we've been talking about, these non-residential spaces, you would not be allowed to carry in it. It has to be a livable space, a space made for living in order to carry in it, according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, and that is a maximum of a beis sa'asayim. So according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, in order to carry in an enclosed area, It has to be a beis ha'asayim or smaller, and it must be for living in. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, says Rabbi Yehuda, afilu ein ba ela bor v'shiach u'ma'ara metaltalim b'socha. Rabbi Yehuda says, look, you do need something in there in order to be able to carry in there, but it doesn't have to be like a house or something residential. It can even be a pit or a ditch or a cave. Epis, there has to be something in that enclosed area. And then if there's something in the enclosed area, then already you can carry in it as long as it is up to a beis ha'asayim. But if there's nothing in that enclosed area, well, then you can't carry, even if it's less than a beis ha'asayim or less. There must be something in there. Rabbi Akiva Omer afilu ein ba achas mikol elu metatlan b'socha uvavad sheyeheba shiv mama v'shiv mama v'shirayim al shiv mama v'shirayim. Whereas Rabbi Akiva gives us the opinion that we're sort of accustomed to at this point, which is that if you have a non-residential space, a karpaf, even if there's nothing in the space, you basically take a wall and you enclose some area, as long as it is 5,000 square amos or less, a beis ha'asayim or less, you can carry in there, even if there's no ditch or no house or anything. You have an area that's enclosed by walls that is non-residential. It's not made for living in. As long as it is 70 2/3 amas by 70 2/3 amas or less, you can carry in this space. Fine. The Gemara is going to ask, what makes Rabbi Akiva's opinion different than the opinion of the Tanakama, i.e., the opinions that we've seen until now, which basically say the same thing, that a karpaf, which is a non-residential space, you can carry up to a beis ha'asayim. What makes Rabbi Akiva different? As I said a minute ago, it's going to have to deal with that nafkamina between 4,994 versus 5,000. Fine. Let's go weiter, Chevra. First I have to find my place. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, says Rabbi Eliezer, Im haisa orka yaser al rochba, if the length of the karpaf, if the length of this space was longer than its width, i.e. it wasn't a perfect square, afilu ama achas, even if its length is greater than its width by even 1 amma, ein metaltalim b'socha, you're not allowed to carry in this space anymore. Rabbi Yossi Omer, says Rabbi Yossi, afilu orka pishnayim berochba metaltalim b'socha. Rabbi Yossi says, look, as long as it has a total of 5,000 square amos, it doesn't have to be an exact square. It can even be, have its length double its width. You can even, divide up this space 100 amos long by 50 amos wide. That would be acceptable according to Rabbi Yossi. Now, Rabbi Eli quotes 3 things that he alleges in the name of apparently his Rabbi Eliezer. Now, none of these things are accepted, as we're going to see, by anybody else. Rabbi Eli, Shamati Rabbi, it says here Rabbi Elazar, but they change it to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eli, Shamati Rabbi Eliezer, Vafilu Yikives Kor. So now Rabbi Eli says that he heard from Rabbi Eliezer that, I guess that this karpaf can even, basically has no limit. It can even be a base core, but we're going to see that nobody seems to accept this. V'chein shamati mimenu, and says Rabbi Eli, I also heard from Rabbi Eliezer, anshe chatzor sheshachach echad mehem v'lo erev. What happens if you have a bunch of fellows and they own homes in a chatzer? Okay, so you have a chatzer. There's, let's say, 5 houses that open up into it. Okay, now everyone wants to be able to carry in that chatzer, so what they do is they're going to make an erev, so that the entire chatzer is jointly owned by this one conglomerate that consists of all the homeowners in the chatzer. Essentially, they're going to make an eruvei chatzeres. That's what they're going to do. But what, of course, happens when you're trying to get a whole bunch of people together to do something? There's a nudnik. When they went to make their chatzer, this nudnik was out at the mikveh, and he didn't make a chatzer with them. Now what do you do? You guys all wanted to make a eruv so you can carry in the chatzer. This guy's at the mikveh. So what do you do? So here's what happens. So you make your eruv, you make your eruv without the nudnik. Okay? And then, so beiso asur lachnis lo otzilo avalem mutter. So an interesting thing happens. So everybody else in the chatzer makes their eruv. The nudnik is not included. Now, he is unable to carry and take advantage of the Eruv because he's not part of it. So he can't carry in and out of his house or anything like that. However, the other chevra in the Chatzar who made this Eruv, and there's an important point which Rashi points out, which is that this Nudnik, he's then mevatel his space to the rest of the people, meaning he wasn't included in the Eruv. But what he could say is, look, I'm being mevatel my space to the conglomerate. Now it's clear the conglomerate owns everything, but nonetheless, this Nudnik is unable to carry in and out of the Chatzar, but everybody else would be able to carry from the Chatzar into his house. So let's say he's inviting everybody else over for lunch, they would be able to, for a potluck, they would be able to bring things to his house, no problem. But if the potluck was by somebody else's house, this guy wouldn't be able to bring anything, by way of the Chatzar. Okay, very interesting story with a Chatzar and a Nudnik. V'chein shamati, and says Rabbi Eli, in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, and similarly I heard mimenu from Rabbi Eliezer, shiyotin ba'arkavlin ba'pesach, that you can use something called arkavlin for maror on Pesach. Okay? And then says Rabbi Eli that he, searched among all of the students of Rabbi Eliezer to see if there's anybody, if he's crazy, or if anybody else also heard this from Rabbi Eliezer, and apparently nobody else heard these things from Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, very interesting. Says the Gemara, my Tana Tikatani V'od. The Gemara wants to know, how come the Mishnah says V'od Amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava? Why not just say Amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava? Now, of course, the previous Mishnah, which we also learned today, had the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava to say that Pasei bayraos is only relevant when it is both a well and it is in the public area. Now, or owned by the public, or available to the public. And now we have another opinion of Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava about the karpafs, saying that it has to be residential space in order to carry there. The Gemara wants to know, how come it says the word ve'od? And additionally, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says, why not just state the two opinions of Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava without the word ve'od? Chevra, that's what we're trying to figure out. If it's going to be because, we just said one chumrah of Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, which is that a Pasei bayraos is only an available option for public wells. And now he's saying another chumrah, which is that a karpaf you can only carry in there if it's residential. So because he's saying back-to-back chumras, so we say ve'od. There's chumrah number 1 and ve'od, and additionally there's chumrah number 2. Okay. Mishumachi katani ve'od. That's why it says ve'od. V'ha Rabbi Yehuda. But one second, what about Rabbi Yehuda? The Tanya, not Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, regular Rabbi Yehuda, Bar Ilai. V'ha Rabbi Yehuda, the Tana le chad el chumra v'katani achrise v'lo katani ve'od. But Rabbi Yehuda mentioned 2 chumras, and we don't say ve'od. What are his 2 chumras? Chumrah number 1 is in the first Mishnah in our parak, which is that Pasei bayraos has a maximum size of beis sa'asayim, as opposed to the Chachamim who said it can be, even a kor or a korayim, it can be much larger. So chumrah number 1 from Rabbi Yehuda is that Pasei bayraos has a maximum size of a beis sa'asayim. And chumrah number 2 from Rabbi Yehuda is that we learned yesterday that if you have a Pasei bayraos that Rishus HaRabim passes through it, you have to divert Rishus HaRabim. You can't have it pass through the Pasei bayraos. So we see that Rabbi Yehuda in our parak has 2 chumras. V'lo katani ve'od. And yet it doesn't say ve'od when it says the second chumrah of Rabbi Yehuda, that if you have Rishus HaRabim going through a Pasei bayraos, you have to divert it. So the Gemara answers, yeah, but Hasam afsuku ha'rabbanan, acha lo afsuku ha'rabbanan. The Gemara says, yeah, but there's a difference that by Rabbi Yehuda there was a hefsek of the rabbanan, meaning Rabbi Yehuda said his chumrah, which is that a Pasei bayraos has a maximum size of beis sa'asayim. The Chachamim then responded to him and says, what do you mean it has to be a beis sa'asayim? Don't you admit to us that if you have a gina or a sahar, or no, not a gina, but what was it? A sar and a muktzeh and a chatzar, all these things. So don't you admit that you would have a maximum of like a kor or a korayim, kilo much larger? So because the rabbis responded to Rabbi Yehuda and made kilo a hefsek in his statements, that is why when Rabbi Yehuda then after that says that if Rishus HaRabim in the next Mishnah goes through the Pasei bayraos, you have to divert Rishus HaRabim. We're not going to say ve'od since there was a hefsek in between his 2 chumras. Okay? And the Gemara says what? But just because of a little hefsek, we can't have our fun and say ve'od? But one second, Rabbi Eliezer in Masech the Sukkah, he said, was talking about how many meals you have to have on Sukkos, in your Sukkah, and the rabbis interrupted him, yet when he then picks up again, it says ve'od. So the Gemara says, Asan b'milsei, hu da'afsukua, hacha b'milsei achrisei afsukua. So the Gemara says, yeah, but over there, the hefsek of the Chachamim was still on topic, right? Over there, Rabbi Yehuda was saying, Rabbi Eliezer was saying in Sukkah that you have to eat 14 meals in the Sukkah. The Chachamim say, no, you can eat however many meals you want. Then he says, and then he continues and he says, also Rabbi Eliezer said, if you messed up a meal, you can make it up, right? So we see it was all on the same topic. So even though there was a hefsek, the hefsek was on topic, and that's fine. You could still say ve'od. When it comes to Rabbi Yehuda with his Pasei bayraos, so first he was talking about the maximum size of a Pasei bayraos, then he was talking about Rosh Hashanah being mevat of chatzeros. They're both about Pasei bayraos, but different aspects of Pasei bayraos, different subjects, with the hefsek of the Chachamim in the middle, so therefore we're not going to say ve'od. However, in our case of Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, there's no hefsek at all, and it's two chumras, one after the other, so we say ve'od. Okay, it's interesting to me that the Gemara is getting so caught up on how come we say ve'od. You know, when can we say the word ve'od? When can we not say the word ve'od? But, okay, very good. Chaber, let's go weiter. Rabbi Akiva Omer, afilu ein ba echad mikol elu metaltalim besocha. So says Rabbi Akiva, in the context of a karpaf, that even if you don't have anything in the karpaf, it's pashit, an area that is 70 2/3 amis by 70 2/3 amis or less, and it's pashit, empty. You don't have anything dartin. Nonetheless, you can carry in there as long as it is a beis sa'asayim or less. Of course, a beis sa'asayim being 70 2/3 amis by 70 2/3 amis. Now, the Gemara asks at the very, very top of Chaf Gimel Mud Beis, Rabbi Akiva anu Tanakama. Rabbi Akiva is saying the same thing as Tanakama. No, Tanakama was not in our Mishnah. The Tanakama was in the first Mishnah of the parak. By Pasei bayraos, Rabbi Yehuda says that it's a maximum of 2 beis sa'ah. And the Chacham respond to him. What do they say? They say, Amru they said to Rabbi Yehuda, Lo Amru beis sa'asayim el legino le karpaf. That beis sa'asayim is only by a gina, by a garden or a karpaf, a non-residential space. So what do we see? So we see that according to the Tanakama, as a non-residential space, you have a maximum of beis sa'asayim, and essentially that's exactly what Rabbi Akiva is saying. Non-residential space, you have maximum of beis sa'asayim, and you don't need anything else, Darton. You don't need a ditch, you don't need a pit, you don't need a cave, you don't need a house, you don't need a hut, you don't need anything. You just need walls around it, and then you have up to beis sa'asayim. So what's the nafkamina between Rabbi Akiva and the Tanakama? So the Gemara answers, Ike benayu davar muat. What the nafkamina between them is this little bit. And what that means is, if you multiply 70 2/3 by 70 2/3, apparently that is 4,994 amis, which is different than a beis sa'asayim, which is 5,000 square amos. So, according to Rabbi Akiva, it says, look, it has to be 70 2/3 by 70 2/3, i.e., maximum of 4,994 square amos. Whereas the Chachamim, the Tanakama, is talking about beis sa'asayim, which is a beis sa'ah is 2,500 square amas, beis sa'asayim is 5,000 square amas, the nafkamina being those 6 square amas in the middle. Right, that kind of falls through the cracks. Okay. The Tanya, as we learned in a Brayso Rabbi Yehuda Omer, it says Rabbi Yehuda, Davar muat yesh al shivim ama v'shirayim, that there is a small amount that is difference between 70 2/3 amas square and 5,000 square amas. But the Chachamim weren't really too makbid on those 6 square amas, and rather, v'chama shi'ur, what is the shi'ur that you're allowed by a karpaf? Sa'asayim, k'chaser amishkan, 2 sa'ah, 5,000 square amos, like the chaser of the Mishkan. That the chaser of the Mishkan, at least the first half of the chaser of the Mishkan was 50, really the entire chaser of the Mishkan was 100 amos long by 50 amas wide. Now 100 times 50 is 5,000, so it was a total of 5,000 square amas. And then the Gemara asks, Mina hane mile. Now, how do we know this? How do we know, where do we have a precedent from the Torah that a karpaf should be, have a maximum size of Beis Asayim of 5,000 square amos, like the square amos of the Chatzer of the Mishkan, which was 100 by 50. So now, of course, a karpaf is a din midrabanan, but we're asking where we have an asmachta for this halacha. And Amar Rav Yehuda, says Rav Yehuda, the Amar Kra, that the pasuk says, Orech echatzer mea ba'ama v'rochav chamishim b'chamishim. That the Torah says that the length of the Chatzer of the Mishkan was 100 amos and its width was 50 by 50. And the question is, what is the Torah teaching us? Because we already know from other psukim that the length of the Chatzer was 100 and its width was 50. So what is this pasuk teaching us? And what's this 50 by 50 thing about? Right, it says the length was 100, the width was 50 by 50. What does that mean? So the Gemara is making a drasha, and the drasha is to say that it's teaching us about the maximum size of a karpaf, which is Amar Torah, the Torah said, Tol chamishim v'sabev chamishim. Take the, right, so if you basically take the chatzer, which is 100 length by 50 width, and cut it into two squares of 50 by 50, and then you take, let's say, the second square, the further one back, right, and you use that to expand the size of the first square, i.e. the first 50 by 50 amos area of the Mishkan, and what you want to do is you want to expand that symmetrically so that you can use up all the space from the second square to expand the first square so that it has double the area of, right, so you can expand the first square so that you double its area, i.e. its area was initially 50 by 50, which is 2,500. You want to expand the square symmetrically so that its area is 5,000. So that is how you would get your, so basically take the second square of 50 by 50 and then use its area to expand the first square so that it's double its space, its area, and you will find that you will have a chatzer that's essentially 70 2/3 by 70 2/3 or 5,000 square amos. Great. So that is where we see in the Torah that a karpaf should be basically 70 2/3 or by 70 2/3, which is essentially 5,000 square amos. The nafkamina, of course, being between Rabbi Akiva and the Chacham. We pass on the Chacham that you have until 5,000 square amos. Fine. Great. Right, so Orech HaChatzer Mea Be'ama V'rochav Chamishim B'Chamishim Amar Torah, the Torah says, Tol Chamishim, so take kilu the 50 by 50 of the second half of the Chatzer, V'sabev Chamishim, and use it to kind of expand the initial 50 by 50 area so that its area is double. Pashte the krab maiksiv. Now, what's the pshat in the pasuk talking about? Because obviously it's not talking about karpafs, because karpafs is a din d'rabban. How do you explain this pasuk based on its pshat in relation to the chatzer of the Mishkan? So Abai says, Abai hamid Mishkan asfas chamishim kidei shei chamishim amal lefanav ve'esrim amal choruach v'ruach. So it says Abai, what the pshat in the pasuk is, what does it mean chamishim b'chamishim? It means that you can view the chatzer of the Mishkan as if it's two areas of 50 amos each, right? Because it's 100 amos long by 50 amos wide. So you can kind of divide that into two and you have two squares of 50 by 50. And it's saying take the Mishkan. The Mishkan was 30 amos long by 10 amos wide. Take that and put it at the very beginning of the second half of the Chatzer. So you have basically the first half of the Chatzer, which is more or less open, and it's 50 by 50. Then in the second half of the Chatzer, that is where your Mishkan is going to be, and it has a width of 10 amos, and then you have 20 amos on either side, since there's a total width of 50 for the courtyard, and 20 amos behind it, whatever. That is your Chatzer of the Mishkan. Rabbi Eliezer Omer im haisa orka chules. Now Rabbi Eliezer had said in the Mishnah that if its length was any longer than its width, well then shvachimaisis, this karpaf you won't be able to carry in there. But one second, we have a brayso that says Rabbi Eliezer Omer im haisa orka yaser al pishnayim birochba afilu ama Achas ein metaltalin besocha. 1 second. We have a brayso that says that Rabbi Eliezer isn't saying that it has to be exactly square, and if it's any larger than exactly square, if it's any larger, if let's say the length is even 1 amma longer than the width, it's going to be a problem. But 1 second, we have a brayso in which it says what? Right? Im haisa orka yasar al pishnayim berochba afil amma. Meaning, Rabbi Eliezer is saying that actually the length is supposed to be twice the width. And if it's any larger than twice the width, then it's a problem. Not that it needs to be square, and if it's any larger than a square, if any of the sides is longer than the other, then it's a problem. No, it dafka needs to have a length that is twice the width. But if that ratio becomes any larger than that, that's when it becomes a problem. So is it that he requires a square, or is it that he requires a rectangle? What is it? So Amar Bevai bar Abaye kitnanami masnisin yasser al pishnayim beroch batnan. So Bevai bar Abaye says, okay, so Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah, when he's talking about if there's that extra amma, it becomes a problem, it means in its length more so than its width. Meaning, even in our Mishnah, what Rabbi Eliezer is saying is that if its length is larger than its width, even by 1 amma, it becomes a problem. Fine. But if that's the case, then that's Rabbi Yossi. That's exactly what Rabbi Yossi said. Rabbi Yossi says that the length of the karpaf can even be twice its width. So the nafkamina is this square that we just spoke about a minute ago, right? That we have this asmachta from the Mishkan, that you take the square and you expand it symmetrically until you double its area. So according to Rabbi Yossi, that's really the way things should be done. I.e., the karpaf should be a square, 70 2/3 amma by 70 2/3 amma. That's the ideal way. He says in the Mishnah that even, however, if the length was twice the width, beseder, it's fine as well. But according to Rabbi Yossi, really it should be a square. According to Rabbi Eliezer, however, really it should be a rectangle, like the Mishkan. After all, the Mishkan was 100 amos long by 50 amos wide. That is really the ideal according to Rabbi Eliezer. So the nafkamina between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi is, ideally, should a karpaf be a square or should it be a rectangle? Rabbi Yossi says square, Rabbi Eliezer says rectangle. Fine. Rabbi Yossi Omer Chule, says Rabbi Yossi Itmar, who stated Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, halacha Rabbi Yossi, that the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi, that really the karpaf should be square, as opposed to Rabbi Eliezer, who says it should be rectangular. Okay? Rabbi Bevai, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, halacha Rabbi Akiva. Whereas Rabbi Bevai says the name of Rabbi Yehuda, who says the name of Shmuel, that the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva, that a karpaf doesn't need any, furnishings, doesn't need pits, ditches, anything like that. Houses, even if it's empty, you can carry in there. V'tavayu l'kula, and both Rav Bevai's statement as well as Rav Yosef's statement are l'kula. Utzricha, we need both of them. The Ashmina halacha Rav Yossi. If we only would have heard that the halacha is like Rav Yossi, that the karpaf should be square, hava amina adika shomera ovezdira. I might think, okay, so the karpaf needs to be square, but maybe I'll think that I also need to put like a guard's hut in there, or a house. Kamash Malan, halacha Rabbi Akiva, therefore we're also saying that the halacha Rabbi Akiva, that you don't need to put anything in there. And if we would say just that the halacha Rabbi Akiva, that you don't need anything in the karpaf, I might think, okay, fine, you don't need anything there, but it still needs to be square. Therefore, we said halacha Rabbi Yossi, that even if it was longer than it was wide, it would be acceptable. Okay, Chaver, now we get into this new kind of thing about where some guy had this karpaf that was larger than a beis sa'asayim, and it was for living in it, and therefore there was no problems. But then he made problems by planting seeds in there. So that's what we're going to talk about. It was a little bit hard to learn and to conceptualize, but I think once I conceptualized it, it wasn't hard anymore, so hopefully it won't be hard. But don't get nervous. We don't have that much left, and I don't think it'll be so hard. So, karpaf shu yoser mi beis sa'asayim. So if you have a karpaf that is larger than a beis sa'asayim, okay? So because it's larger than a beis sa'asayim, so if it was just a karpaf, like a non-residential space, then that would be a problem. You can't carry in there. However, shehukaf l'dira, but it was created for living in. So it's not really a karpaf, it's really more of a chotzer. Basically, you have a space that was made for living, larger than a beis hasayim. There's no problem with that. Now, nizra rubo areu kegina v'aser. However, if you then start planting like seeds in there, planting like vegetables and stuff in there, well, then you're messing with its status. And if the majority of this area now is filled with seeds that have been planted, well, it's no longer a residential area. It's a planting area. So it's a gina, which is essentially the same thing as a karpaf. And since the majority of this space is now for planting, so it's basically a karpaf, and it's larger than a beis hasayim. And what happens is, even the area that is not yet planted is batel to the area that is planted, because it's a majority of this planted space. And essentially what you have is an area that is larger than a beis hasayim and is a karpaf. So you can't carry in there anymore. Okay, fine. Nata rubo areu kechatzer umoter. But if you planted trees in a majority of the area, well, that's completely fine. I mean, trees are great. You have a residential space larger than a beis hasayim. You have trees over there for shade. I mean, that sounds like a really nice space to live, right? Nice big plot of land. It's 70 2/3 amos by 70 2/3 amos. Is that a lot or a little? What's that? That's like 120 feet by 120 feet. Maybe it's not that much. Yeah, maybe it's not that much. Oh no, it's pretty small, right? All right, what can I tell you? So he's got a small little area that's got like trees. Whatever, it still sounds nice. Great. So if the majority is trees, then that's no problem, because that's for, it's totally a residential space that you planted trees. Okay, fine. Now, we had said nizra rubo, right? So if you had planted seeds, like vegetable kind of seed things, in the majority of it, so then it's a problem, because the majority is now essentially a karpaf use, which makes the minority batel to it. Now you just have a space larger than a beis hasayim. That's a karpaf, and you can't carry in there. Now, Amar Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua, and I think that the key to understanding Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua is to say that he's conceptualizing differently. He's conceptualizing this case differently. He's not viewing this as a case of rov and miut. He's not viewing this as like there's a majority and a minority, and therefore the minority is batel to the majority. He is not viewing it that way. He's viewing these as two separate areas. You have this enclosed space. Part of it is planted for these vegetable seeds. Part of it is still for residential use. And we don't say, well, what's the majority, what's the minority? We don't. We say, look, we have these two separate spaces. One of them is for planting. One of them is treated as a karpaf and as the halachis of a karpaf. The other is a chatzer and as the halachis of a chatzer. Okay? Now, Amar Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua lo amaran ella yosem mibeis hasayim. Okay? When we say that there is a problem if the majority of this space is planted with seeds, well, that's really only if this space is larger than a beis hasayim. Because if you have in this enclosed area an area that is planted with seeds, and it is large, and the seeded area is larger than a beis hasayim, well, that's a problem, because you essentially have a gina or a karpaf, which is non-residential. Now you're allowed up to a maximum of beis hasayim, but you exceeded that maximum. It's larger than a beis hasayim. So that area you would not be allowed to carry in. And now you have this other part of the chatzer, which is you haven't yet planted in. So it's just a regular chatzer, which theoretically on its own would be acceptable, but because there's no, right, remember that awesome sugya of nifrit sabim lo l'makom ha'aser? Don't get too worried about it, but just remember that if you have a space where you're allowed to carry, and a space that you're not allowed to carry, and they're completely open one to the other, you can't carry in either one of them. And therefore, says Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua, look, we're just going to look at each of these areas separately. We're going to look at the gina, we're going to look at the planted area, and say, look, If this planted area is larger than a beis sa'asayim, well, you can't carry in there, it's too big. And because it's completely open to this other part of this enclosed area, which is not planted at all, it's more of a chatzer, so me'ikrat in that area would be fine, but because it's completely open to this seated area, you can't carry in the open area either. Okay? However, right, so aval, beis sa'asayim, if the seated area is a beis sa'asayim or less, well then there's no problem, mutter. You can carry between them. Because what's the problem? You have the seated area. The seated area is a beis sa'asayim or less, and therefore it's essentially a karpaf. As long as it's a beis sa'asayim or less, you can carry in the karpaf. Then you have the other area, which there's nothing planted there. That's a chatzer. You can carry in the chatzer. The only question is, can you carry from a karpaf to a chatzer? And Rav Huna bar Yeshua is assuming yes, you can. And says the Gemara, Kreb Shimon. It's like Reb Shimon's opinion, as we learned in Gemara Shabbos and Daf Kuf Lamed. Ditnan Reb Shimon Omer, says Reb Shimon, Echad gagos ve'echad chatzeres ve'echad karpafs. If you have a roof, if you have a chatzer, if you have a karpaf, rishus achas hein lekelim sheshabsu b'sochem lo lekelim sheshabsu b'soch habayis. As long as we're talking about things that when Shabbos started they were in these areas and not inside. So if you have something that when Shabbos started was in a chatzer, so then you can carry it from a chatzer to a karpaf. No problem. So therefore, Rav Huna bar Yeshua is saying the same thing over here, that you have this enclosed area, part of it was seated, part of it was not. As long as the seated area is a beis sa'asayim or less, well then it's just a karpaf that is within its limits and it is allowed. You can carry there. You can also carry in the open area because that's just a chatzer. And if we assume that it's like Reb Shimon that you can carry from a chatzer to a karpaf and vice versa, what's the big deal? You can carry in this area. So we're going to stop here. There are going to be kashas on Rav Huna bar Yeshua, like the fact that, well, but isn't the majority the seated area, and then shouldn't the other part be bata? We're going to get there. But for now, I think that that's all we need to know for this machlokas. Shtickle cliffhanger. Sorry to leave you in there, but in order to finish this properly, we'd have to go weiter for a little bit. And as a evil dictator, I decreed that we're going to stop here. Chevra, let us go over what we learned today. So we started off with the machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava regarding the context for a pasei bayraos. Where can you create one? Where can you not? So Rabbi Akiva says, when it comes to wells, well, it could be public or private. No problem. You can make a pasei bayraos. If it comes to a watering hole, a bore, well, then only if it's public can you make pasei bayraos. Essentially, according to Rabbi Akiva, the only place where you cannot make pasei bayraos is by a private bore. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says actually the only place where you can make pasei bayraos is by a public well. Okay, fine. Now, in terms of requirements for a karpaf, can it be empty? Do you need things in there? So Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava has the most stringent opinion, which is that it must be a residential space with a maximum of 70 2/3 amas by 70 2/3 amas in order to be able to carry in this space. Rabbi Yehuda says it doesn't necessarily have to have a house, it doesn't have to be residential, but there has to be episdar in there. Has to be a pit, a ditch, a cave, epis. Rabbi Akiva says there's no requirements at all other than the fact that it can have a maximum of 70 2/3 amas by 70 2/3 amas. The Gemara said, asked what makes him different than the Tanakama. So the Tanakama says that you have a maximum of 5,000 square amas, whereas technically according to Rabbi Akiva, you have a maximum of 4,994 square amas. Fine. And then in terms of does it have to be square or not, Rabbi Eliezer says actually ideally it should be rectangular, like the chatzar of the Mishkan was rectangular, 100 amas by 50 amas. Whereas Rabbi Yossi says actually ideally it should be square, like we learned out from that asmachta from the pasuk of taking the second half of the chatzar and using its area to expand the area of the first half to make it essentially 70 2/3 by 70 2/3. At the end, then we got into a chatzar that is larger than 2 beis sa'ah, that you then went and planted seeds in it in order to make a headache. So then we said, so the first way to understand it is that, look, it's based on rov and miut. If the majority of the space is seeded, well then the minority of it becomes batel to the majority, and you have a seeded space that is larger than a beis sa'asayim, you can't carry it anywhere. Whereas Rav Huna bar Yeshua says, look, we can actually view them as two separate parts of this chatzer. You have the seeded part, and you have the open part. We say as long as the seated part is within 2 beis sa'asayim or less, well, you can carry in there as a karpaf, and you can also carry in the chotzer as just a residential space, and you can carry between them as well, so you can really carry in the entire area. We're going to get to some questions on that tomorrow. Chevra, have an awesome day or night or whatever. Peace.